Apart from the Bible and probably the Roman law codes, the most widely circulated and influential piece of writing from antiquity was Virgil's epic poem called the Aeneid. And while this is perhaps not as famous today as the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, for the Middle Ages, this was the great epic of antiquity. It was the one that they knew, and it's particularly influential on a figure like Dante, who we're going to read some of. But it was widely known. Anyone who was educated in the Middle Ages almost certainly had some awareness of the Aeneid. Many of them had read it and studied it assiduously. It was said that Dante probably had it memorized, all roughly 300 or 400 pages of this thing in its in its Latin form, and so the influence of this, at least on educated circles, was almost inestimable. And there's a great deal of information in the Aeneid on war and death. We're going to look mostly at death here, but I will mention some things about its attitudes about war. Virgil was a Roman poet who lived, and his most important works like this, and then his poems called the Georgics, were written during the early reign of Augustus Caesar. Augustus became the first Roman emperor around the year 27 BCE, after winning the Battle of Actium against his chief rival Marcus Antonius in the year 31 BCE. And he ruled until 14 CE. And so he had a long 40 to 45 year reign, and really remade Rome, the political system in particular, kind of recrafted it, even though he was careful to make it look like he wasn't really changing anything. He was in fact changing everything. And that's a topic that would occupy far too much of our time and attention here if we were to go into some detail about it. But that is the backdrop for the writing of the Aeneid, and Virgil was in fact in the employ, and really the pay of Augustus. And Augustus was trying to sponsor artists and writers and poets and philosophers, much like the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt had done previous to them. And, he was not the originator of this kind of enterprise. But he was trying to increase the glory of his empire and to link in his accomplishments with the mythological past. The Romans had a sense of their origins from legends that had been told orally for a very long time. There were historians and others who had written down some of these details. The Romans believed that they were descendants of the Trojans, and there were stories of heroes fleeing the ashes of Troy after the Trojan War and coming to Italy and conquering territory there. There was one figure in particular named Aeneas, who is a figure actually in the Iliad. He's a named character in the Iliad. But he became the one seen as the kind of originator of the Roman people, and from him came Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, and then others, of course. And so Virgil is tapping into the Trojan War mythology here, but he's not the first to do this. The Romans had been doing this for hundreds of years by this point. But he also evinces some contemporary concerns, specifically the recrafting of the political system under Augustus Caesar. The narrative of the Aeneid, and it's in 12 books. The first 6 books are about a ship voyage where Aeneas and his men leave Troy. There's actually, in flashback, a recounting of the final battle for Troy, including the Trojan horse story. It's actually in this text that the story of the Trojan horse is told in its fullest form. That's book 2 of the Aeneid. After leaving Troy and leaving behind many of his companions and even his wife, who died in the chaos of the battle, Aeneas and his father Anchises and his son Iulus make it first to North Africa, where he has a brief kind of affair or fling with the Carthaginian queen Dido. And here Virgil is setting up the rivalry between Carthage and Rome. The Carthaginians and the Romans fought 3 wars called the Punic Wars. Virgil ascribes this to this kind of spurned love that Aeneas, driven by fate, had to leave Dido behind, and she became angry, and not just angry, she became almost completely unhinged, committed suicide, and then cursed Aeneas and his people, and said that their peoples would never be at peace with one another. So that's kind of the backdrop to this. When they finally reach Italy, Aeneas follows much the same path that Odysseus had in the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is obviously the inspiration for the ship voyage story here, where he is instructed to go into the underworld, specifically to learn about his fate. Now, his father, Anchises, has died in the meantime, and so he wants to go and visit his father in the underworld. One of the key aspects of the Aeneid, and really kind of the Roman conception of the universe generally, is the notion of fate, right? That fate is something that is outside the control of both humans and gods. The gods may know the fates, but they are subject to them nevertheless. And Aeneas is fated to do certain things, and he is driven on by fate. And much of the story of the Aeneid is about Aeneas trying to understand what his fate is and reach that fate, which then, you have to wonder if there's a question of free will in all of this. That seems never to be something that occupies a lot of attention. He is opposed in this by a number of people, some of whom may understand that Aeneas is fated to do this, but they're fighting against it. The most prominent of these is the goddess Juno, known as Hera in Greek, of course. This is the queen of the gods. And she doesn't like the Trojans for a number of reasons that we don't need to get into. But she tries to thwart Aeneas in every one of his efforts. She tries to, get him to settle down with Dido in Carthage, and that doesn't happen. And she tries to inspire the inhabitants of Italy to fight against him. And the second half of the work is all a story of the war between the Rutulians, one of the native Italian peoples, and the Trojans led by Aeneas. And Aeneas, of course, conquers the Rutulians and defeats their champion Turnus at the end. And, the story goes from there that he marries a princess of the Latins named Lavinia, and, has children by her. But it's from his son Iulus that he then fathers the line of great Romans from which comes Romulus and Remus and all of that, right? So that's the fate. Juno knows that, and she is told that by Jupiter, but she tries to oppose it nevertheless, and ultimately has to admit that she cannot oppose fate, right? She finally backs down at the end. Book 6 of the Aeneid, which is what I instructed you to read, or required you to read for this week, deals with the topic of the afterlife. This is where Aeneas takes a journey into the underworld, which is controlled, of course, by Pluto, known as Hades in Greek. A lot of the stories of mythology about the underworld underlie this, or are assumed that the readers would know these stories, like the story of Hades and Persephone, or Pluto and Proserpina are the Latin names. That's all in the background of this. All of the key characters and kind of geographic features of the underworld show up here. Things like the river Styx and the ferryman Charon. This is a map that somebody mocked up. I found this online. It's not of my own making, but I think it's a pretty decent depiction of this. Aeneas has to convince Charon that to allow him to cross the river Styx, even though he's still alive, for instance. And then they have to kind of deal with Cerberus, the three-headed dog. That's actually easy for them to do. And then, there are two main parts of the underworld. One is called Tartarus, and this is kind of like the Roman hell. And then the other one is called the Elysian Field, or Elysium, and this is like the Roman heaven, right? Aeneas's guide in all of this is this figure known as the Cumaean Sibyl. This is a kind of legendary priestess of Apollo, who was seen as the gatekeeper for the underworld, and also a prophetess who knew the future. And so she is Aeneas's guide in all of this. She's the one who knows the way. She has been into the underworld before, knows the path, and knows what to do at each step of the way. I want to look at some bits of the text here. Okay, so the first thing that Aeneas has to do in order to get into the underworld in the first place is to obtain this gift for Proserpina, for Persephone. It's called the Golden Bough, and he says, look, I need to know what my fate is, and the way that I'm going to learn that is that I need to go into the underworld. And here again, Virgil is just imitating Homer. And Odysseus in the Odyssey ventures into the underworld. He doesn't actually go very far, and there's not a lot of description about it. He just mostly meets with various figures like Achilles, who has died in the meantime, and Agamemnon shows up, and his own mother, who has passed away, shows up to talk to him, right? And he is told much of what awaits him, right, by the Sibyl herself, okay? She says, already a new Achilles springs to life in Latium, son of a goddess too. So there's this figure in Italy who is going to oppose you. This is a reference to the figure Turnus, who shows up as his main enemy in the second part of the text. And you're going to get married to a Latin or an Italian princess. And, your fate is all of this, right? And he says, yes, but I still want to go talk to my father. Allow me to go and see my beloved father, meet him face to face. I'm ready to take this on, but I want to talk to my dad, right? And she says, but nobody can get in there unless they have a gift for Proserpina. And there's this thing called the Golden Bough. There's a tree that has golden fruit, and I need you to go get that. And you're only going to be able to get this if fate decrees it. And, it turns out that fate does decree it, right? So Aeneas has a very easy time. He goes and finds the golden bough and plucks it off and takes it back to the Sibyl. And in the meantime, they find one of his companions who was drowned unexpectedly, and they bury him, and so we get a little depiction of the funeral rites of the ancient Romans here, okay, where they are dealing with the body and burning it and all of that, okay. Now, the description of the underworld, one of the reasons that I refer to this and wanted you to read a bit of the Aeneid, specifically this part, is, first of all, this is terribly influential. We're going to see that the geography of the underworld is described by Virgil, is imitated by and largely copied by Dante as he lays out the structures of hell in the Inferno. And we're going to read some parts of that. There are, for instance, 9 circles. There is a judgment. There are some other things. There are these rivers there, right? And there are divisions between peoples, okay? There are these monsters that he meets when he first, kind of enters the underworld. He sees all of these things, or he sees these kind of shades of these things. And so this is a scary place. It's a daunting place. And Dante is going to pick up on that. Sorry for the little pun there. It's daunting for Dante, right? But it's something that Dante picks up on, the mood of the whole thing, the pervasive kind of oppressive mood of at least part of the underworld here is going to be imitated. And he says, and then he comes across, Charon the ferryman, and Charon's like, look, dude, I'm going to lose my job if you don't get on here, right? I've had these, let's see, where is this? Yeah, I've had these experiences before where, like Hercules came and forced me to take him into the underworld, and Pluto got really angry with me and all of that, and the Sibyl says, look, we've got the golden bough. He's allowed in. This is his ticket in. And Charon's like, okay, not my business, right? And he ferries him across. One of the things, and this is actually before they talk to Charon, they come across this group of people. And he asks, why are some of the people not allowed to get across the river? And the Sibyl tells him quite simply, the great route you see is helpless, still not buried. And so, according to the Greek and Roman understanding of things, if your body was not buried, and this includes if you die at sea, then you cannot get across the river Styx. They will not allow you. And so, burial, having some dirt thrown over you, was absolutely essential. And it turns out that he meets among the group of the unburied one of his men who had died in the ship voyage, had been swept over. His name is Palinurus. He had been one of the ship pilots. And Palinurus says, please go find my body and bury me. And the Sibyl tells him, the Sibyl, of course, has access to all sorts of information. She says to him, look, somebody's going to find your body and they're going to erect a monument to you and bury you. And so don't worry about it, right? Don't bother Aeneas with all of this. And Palinurus is satisfied with all of that. Once they get across the river Styx, we find judgment. And the one who is judging is this fellow named Minos. Minos, the ancient king of Crete. This is a figure from mythology. He is seen as, a just ruler, so to speak. So it makes sense that he would be in charge of judgment, right? And it turns out that, certain people go to certain parts of the underworld. So he mentions, for instance, innocents who brought on death by their own hands. We've got people who've committed suicide here. They long for the world above. They want to go back to their lives. They regret what they did, but fate bars the way for them. And so Styx, with its 9 huge coils, holds them captive. There's like a marsh with 9 terraces on it here, right? This is where Dante ends up with his 9 circles of hell. And this holds these suicides captives. And they're suicides, but then there are also those who, consumed by the harsh, wasting sickness, cruel love, concealed on lonely paths, shrouded by myrtle bowers. People who had died with unrequited love. And it turns out this is where Aeneas runs across his old flame Dido. And this is an awkward meeting. When last they met, she was cursing him and threatening to kill him, and he kind of got out before he could, her vengeance could fully take effect. And she had killed herself. And, he's like, oh, this is kind of awkward to meet you here, Dido. I'm really sorry for everything that happened. It wasn't my fault. All of these terrible excuses. It wasn't you, it was me, kind of thing. And she just doesn't say anything to him. She just walks away from him, right? And so this is, kind of, imagine meeting up with, your old lover very awkwardly later in life that had a terrible breakup. You never spoke to each other again, and suddenly you're face to face with that person, right? That's the awkwardness of all of this. There also are people who died in battle kind of before their time here, right? So people with unfinished business are sort of stuck in this part of the afterlife. When they get beyond this, there are 2 other parts of the afterlife. One is, or the underworld, I should say. One is called Tartarus. And as I said, this is the Roman version of hell. They don't call it hell necessarily. And Aeneas and the Sibyl don't actually go in. The Sibyl simply describes this for him. She says, as part of my job, I had to go in, kind of a tour of Tartarus. And she describes the people who were there. Okay. We might say that, these are the Roman versions of sins. They didn't use that terminology. This is, of course, Judeo-Christian terminology. But I don't know what else to describe it. Misdeeds. Here are those who hated their brothers while alive, or struck their fathers down, or embroiled clients in fraud, or brooded alone over troves of gold they gained and never put aside some share for their own kin. So in other words, people who had betrayed in some way their family or close associates, right? The Romans had a system of patronage and clientage, so people who had clients, and I'm not going to go into details here, but people they should have taken care of, should have been close to, and they chose not to do that, or they became enemies to them, they killed them, right? Hated them. That's a massive violation of a social norm, and that's what lands a person in Tartarus. And there are all sorts of punishments that happen here. There's even a flaming river called Phlegethon that rings Tartarus, as you can see from the map here. And there's a fury called Tisiphon there who is beating people, and we're going to see this later in Dante as well. Here is one who bartered his native land for gold, so committed treason. He saddled her with a tyrant. Somebody committed incest, it says, right? And then they end up there. They don't spend much time talking about Tartarus, just a bit of information about that. The largest part, and toward the end here, we get into Elysium, and this is the nice place. This is the Roman version of heaven. It's in the underworld. And there are a few pieces of information that are relevant here. One of these is that the Romans, see the underworld, the nice part, as a kind of continuation. If you like good things in life, you would continue to do those things there. They see soldiers training with their arms. They see people, sort of sitting around in nice grassy meadows, reciting poetry and talking philosophy and all of that, right? And then he comes upon his father Anchises. And Anchises, it says, is counting over his own people, all his cherished heirs. And so Anchises is surrounded by his yet unborn descendants. And these are the ones who he talks to Aeneas about. There is a river in Elysium called Lethe, where some people who make it there are not satisfied with this. And they spend some time in Elysium, but then they drink from the river Lethe. All of their previous memories are wiped out, and they end up taking another life. They're reborn to a different life. So the Romans have a notion of kind of reincarnation. Not everyone does this. Some are satisfied to end this cycle of life and to spend the rest of their time in Elysium, or in what's sometimes called the fields of gladness. But others, long to return to life. So he says this. And it seems that some of those who are to be born as his descendants may be those who came before him. So descendants and ancestors at the same time. The Romans had a very, very strong notion of family ties between, and the Roman word, or the Latin word familia, which is the origin of the term family, right? English word family, it's just, same in Romance languages, familia. This is very powerful. The Romans had a real sense of ties between people and their ancestors and their descendants, and responsibilities that they had to remember their ancestors and to think about their descendants, and so all of those social norms come up here in the Aeneid. And among these people who are yet to be born, right, the future heirs of our name, says Anchises to him, okay, we find all of the great Romans of history, some from mythology and some from actual history. Here's Romulus, right, the founder of Rome. Caesar and all the line of Iulus. Iulus is Aeneas' son, but notice the common name there, or the very close kind of cognate with Julius, thus Julius Caesar. And that's kind of a play on words that he inserts into that. And then, of course, after Julius Caesar comes Augustus Caesar. And he goes on at some length praising Augustus Caesar, talking about everything he's going to accomplish. This, of course, is sucking up to his patron, but linking Aeneas with the glorious mythological past. And he goes on to talk about other great Romans from history who we don't need to get into necessarily because this is running somewhat long, right? So in short, and all of this gives Aeneas, right, this fires his soul with a love of glory still to come, and tells him next to the wars that he must wage. And Aeneas emerges from the underworld ready to then take on the challenges of the war that he is about to fight, because it's all about fighting for his legacy, ensuring his fate, and making sure that his descendants will have the kingdom that they are fated to have. A lot of these concepts get taken up in the Middle Ages. Certainly the imagery of all of this is very powerful for people in the Middle Ages. The kind of the geography of the underworld ends up in their notions of hell. But even some of these ideas about fate, are toyed with or treated in some way by theologians and philosophers in the Middle Ages. Some of these ideas are rejected. Some of them are kind of accepted, or accepted in part, and become part of the Christian understanding of things as well. So I'll stop there.